Hello friends, I am Andy C. Luter, a faculty member of the Graduate School of Episcopal Studies. I'm also a founding bishop in the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, and I currently serve the fellowship as its official historian. Not too terribly long ago, I presented information to our College of Bishops on the transition of the disciples of Jesus who later became apostles, who eventually the office was transformed to that of bishop. It was a 15 to 20 minute presentation that I was honored to be able to present to our College of Bishops. Now, because that particular event was not videotaped, I have decided to redo the presentation in video form so that I might share it with you. So, in just a moment, I'm going to go to our virtual classroom where I will go over the material that I discussed in my presentation to the College of Bishops in the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. Now, I will be forwarding this material and presentation to them, and it very well may be that others of you will come in contact with it as well. I am doing this in part to help promote and introduce our Episcopal School of Episcopal Studies that I do with fellow bishops. We have put together nearly 20 online courses specifically designed to train bishops on how to be a bishop, understanding the role of the episcopacy, being more in touch with the history of the office, and other materials that one who is a part of the episcopacy certainly can appreciate. So listen, I want to personally thank you for joining me and permitting me to share this information with you, and I pray that it will initiate and encourage you to do more study from the material that we have available. So here now, I'm going to our virtual classroom so that I can share with you the transition, or rather the steps involved in the disciples of Jesus leading up to and including the bishops in the early church. Well, again, friends, welcome to the virtual classroom of myself, Andy C. Luter, and I am delighted to be sharing with you this information. Now, as I mentioned during my introduction, this was originally presented and planned for the bishops in the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, our College of Bishops. I have since then organized this material, and I'm presenting it again in video form for those who may not have been in attendance, and for those who were in attendance but did not have an opportunity to record the contents of my original presentation. Now, I don't want to take for granted that those of you who are watching and listening to me are familiar with me, so indulge me for just a moment to talk just a bit about my own background and my own interest in sharing with you this material. I'm a native New Yorker, born in Brooklyn in 1954. I spent my adolescency on Long Island, graduating from Long Island Lutheran High School in 1972. From there, I went on to Oberlin College from 1972 to 1976, where I graduated in 1976 with a triple major in African American Studies, Communications, and Religion. From 1976 to 1979, I attended Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I graduated in 1979 with a Master of Divinity degree. Pushing a little bit forward, in 1995, I attended United Theological Seminary, where I acquired an earned doctoral degree, a Doctor of Ministry degree from the United Theological Seminary of Dayton, Ohio. Now listen, over the years, I've been able to put together 60 online courses in the area of the Bible and religion. And as such, I am currently the president of the New Life School of Theology. I am privileged to be the pastor of two local congregations, the Hollywood Full Gospel Baptist Cathedral of Long Island, New York, along with the Queens Ministry of New York City's Queens Village. I have been at the time of this recording at Hollywood since 2001 in the joint capacity of co-pastor and then later senior pastor. And then, of course, I have been with the Queen's Ministry since 2012. I am the father of 2 and the grandfather of 6. Well, listen, that's enough about me. I just wanted to kind of register that with you so you have some sense of who is talking to you during this presentation. But let's jump into the material that we want to discuss. Now, friends, the purpose of this lecture is to acquaint you, the attendee, with some of the basic concepts that went into the creation of the office of the bishopric at the outset of the Christian movement. Now you'll see here I have posted Christianity as a Jewish sectarian movement. What I'm arguing here is that Christianity did not begin as an independent religion of Judaism, but was seen as literally a radical wing of the existing Jewish religion of that day. Now, my research in this area relies very heavily on David Friedrich Strauss. He was a 19th century scholar, and that of Albert Schweitzer, a 20th century scholar. Now, in their work on researching the historical Jesus, they make it clear that there were some irrefutable factors that greatly influenced the early church. I want to look at what some of those factors that we have gleaned from looking at the historical Jesus. What is clear is that Jesus was a Jewish man who lived in the first century that would have been caught up in the politics of his day. Now, as a result of that, he would have been opposed to at least 3 standing institutions. One of those institutions would have been the occupation of Jerusalem by the Romans. Now, we're less than 200 to 300 years from the Maccabean period, where the Jews had rid themselves of Syrian oppression and occupation. And there was an appetite at the time of Jesus to do to the Romans what the Jewish Maccabean family had done to the Syrians. And so there was this active movement and appetite in literally driving the Romans out of the city of Jerusalem. Secondly, Jesus would have been opposed to the abuse of the priestly class toward the poor. By the time the Hasmonean priesthood, which is an intertestamental movement, had come along, the priesthood had been greatly corrupted. And local Jews of Jesus' time would have been utterly opposed to the Hasmonean Jewish priestly class because of how they had taken advantage of the poor. Now, closely connected to that would have been the corruption of the high priest and his collusion with Rome. Now, what was that collusion? The collusion was that the job of the high priest was to keep the Jews in line for the Romans. The Romans held sway in Jerusalem. They would not even allow the high priest to have his own garments. They would only dispense the garments for the high holy days when it was time to do so. And by controlling the garments, they controlled the priests. So again, there are 3 institutions that people of Jesus' day, and especially Jesus, the historical Jesus, and of course we can talk about the difference between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. I won't do that here, but the historical Jesus would have been opposed to the occupation of Jerusalem by Rome. He would have been opposed to the Hasmonean priestly class, and he would have been opposed to the corruption of the high priest in Jerusalem. Now, as a result of that, Judaism as a religion was seeking a Messiah that would address their immediate concerns. What were those concerns? Those concerns was those items that I mentioned in the previous slide. A messianic figure that would drive the Romans out of Jerusalem, that would take down the Hasmonean priesthood, and that would displace or replace the high priest who was found to be corrupt at that time. Now, as a result of that, Jesus was not the only messianic figure of his day. Now, I know 2,000 years removed, we like to think of Jesus as being the only person that was thought of as a Messiah at that time and since. However, what we find is that there were several figures, messianic figures who competed for that title right alongside Jesus, either during the time of Jesus, before Jesus, immediately after Jesus. Some of those figures would have included a figure that was called the Samaritan, who rose up an army to stand against the Romans. That failed. The Egyptian was another character that was thought to be messianic because he fought against the Romans. Again, he failed. Hezekiah of the desert was a well-known figure during this particular time. And his son, Judas of Galilee, when Hezekiah was moved off the scene and died without the fulfillment of these messianic hopes, he was replaced by Judas of Galilee. Another figure would have been Theudas. I would even mention the teacher of righteousness, who lived some years before Jesus. And I would include in this listing, even though it is not on the screen, even John the Baptist. That delegation that comes down and asks John if he is the Messiah, forcing John to say, "No, I am a voice crying in the wilderness." He would not have had to make that denial if he was not thought to be a Messiah or the Messiah himself. So my point is that at the time of Jesus, there were several other persons who were thought to be the Messiah, who had large followings, who had raised armies, and who competed for the public's attention right alongside of Jesus. Now, friends, here, the earliest converts to Jesus would have expected him to be a messianic figure in the likeness of King David, or like those that I listed in the previous slide. Their decision to follow him would have been based upon the assumption that Jesus would have operated in this vein. So Jesus gathered disciples, and the people followed him because they thought that Jesus would do what the Egyptian had done, what the Samaritan had done, what Hezekiah of the desert had done, what Theudas had done, what the teacher of righteousness had done. And because they expected Jesus to comply with the description of a messianic figure that was operative at that time, the only way Jesus would have gathered a crowd was if he had given the impression that he could do what so many others had failed to do. Now, that brings me to the delay of the parousia. The delay of the parousia is simply means that Jesus did not come back when everybody thought he was coming back. Those who initially were converted to Jesus assumed that he would come back during their earthly lifetime. When that did not happen, the church had to craft leadership that would produce longevity for the church. Remember, you have individuals who thought Jesus is coming any day, any hour, any week. When that didn't happen, the church had to sit down and say, well, since Jesus is not coming when we thought he was coming, we need to create offices in the church that will ensure that whenever Jesus returns, there is a church for him to return to. Now that brings me specifically to the disciples of Jesus. So the office of the bishop is based upon the office of the disciples who would later become apostles. Now the types of disciples included 4. We first have the intimate 3, Peter, James, and John. They were there for transfiguration. They went to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then there are the remaining 9, which make up the 12 that we're familiar with. The intimate 3, the remaining 9, collectively, they represent the 12. And then there were 72 who were sent out 2 by 2 and who came back to Jesus and said, we were able to perform miracles when we used your name. And then when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead and makes his way to Jerusalem, when he gets to the foot of that hill called Bethany, the Bible says there were the multitudes of disciples. So much so until the priesthood and the Pharisees say, Jesus, make them be still. And Jesus said, if I quiet them, the rocks will cry out in their place. So the office of disciple, friend, can come in 4 categories: the intimate 3, the remaining 9, the 72, or the multitude of disciples. Now, that brings me to the year 69 AD. But before I get to the year 69 to 70 AD, let me register. Remember, one of the expectations of a messianic figure was that they would drive the Romans out of Jerusalem. Friends, that actually happened. The driving of the Romans out of Jerusalem actually happened between 66 CE or AD and 69 CE. I'm saying there was a 3-year period where the goal and the objective of driving the Romans out of Jerusalem was accomplished. The tragedy, however, is that the Romans returned after 3 years and retook the land that they had lost 3 years earlier. So from 66 CE to 69 CE, the Jews had driven the Romans out of Jerusalem. However, the Romans would return in 69 CE and reduce Jerusalem to rubble, including the temple. Now, this is called the Jewish Revolt of 70 AD. I invite you to Google this to get more information on it. It included the massacre at Masada, and it left Jerusalem in rubble. Jerusalem was utterly destroyed. And with the destruction of Jerusalem came the destruction of the temple. Now, when the temple was destroyed, this would displace the priestly office and catapult the local rabbis to the role of professional clergy. Now, let me slow down here and see if I can explain this again. So, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed. When the temple is destroyed, the priests have nowhere to operate. When the priests have nowhere to operate, they literally go out of business and become extinct. And with the absence of the priest as the religious leader of the Jews, the rabbi now emerges as the leader of their faith community. Now, consequently, what we go from is temple Judaism to rabbinic Judaism. And all I'm trying to say here is that the kind of Judaism that Jesus would have seen in the first century would have been temple Jerusalem, where the temple was standing and the priests were in charge. Today, there is no longer a temple, there are no longer priests, and consequently, the rabbis are the religious leaders of Judaism, unlike it would have been in the day and the time of Jesus. Now, that's very, very important, because the early church would have to style itself after synagogal Judaism or rabbinic Judaism as opposed to temple Judaism, because temple Judaism was no longer available. And even the church in Jerusalem was destroyed in the Jewish revolt of 70 AD and the massacre of Masada. Both James, the early bishop of Jerusalem, would be assassinated in 69 AD or CE, and even his replacement, Simeon, would die in 71 AD. So the transition from temple Judaism to rabbinic Judaism is extremely important. Now, that brings us to the second generation of church leadership. So once we get beyond the disciples, who now become the apostles, once the apostles died out, they were replaced by a second generation of leaders who adopted the title of bishop so as to distinguish them from the apostolic fathers. So you have Peter, James, John, you have Bartholomew, Nathaniel, those original apostles of Jesus Christ. Or you have the 72, or you have the multitudes. But when all of those individuals die out and Jesus has not returned, there has to be a selection of a new generation of leadership. But this generation so adored and revered the apostolic fathers, or those who were apostles, they did not feel that it was appropriate for them to take the title that the apostles had. So they assumed the work that the apostles had done, but they used the title of bishop so as to distinguish who they were as opposed to who the early apostles would have been. Now, during this time, there are at least 4 specific seasons of suffering and martyrdom and persecution of the church. And I've listed them here on the screen for you so that you can become familiar with them. And I encourage you to look them up, to Google them, and to learn more about them. First would have been Clement of Rome. Second would have been Justin the Martyr. Third would have been Irenaeus. Fourth would have been Tertullian. Now, these are some of the early bishops of the church. They're not to be confused with the apostles of the church. Remember, the apostles were those who were contemporaries of Jesus, who walked with Jesus, who saw Jesus during his earthly lifetime. As a matter of fact, one could not even call himself an apostle unless his testimony included that he had seen Jesus for himself. I don't want to divert too much here, but one of the reasons Paul is insistent on giving his testimony of having seen Jesus on the Damascus Road was because if you could not say that you had seen Jesus, you could not qualify as being an apostle. There is this apostolic constitution, or this dedique, that was used prior to the Bible being canonized. And the dedique clearly said that in order to be recognized as an apostle, you had to have seen Jesus during Jesus's earthly lifetime. These four individuals that I've listed on the screen, this is the second generation. These are not necessarily those who had seen Jesus, who had walked with Jesus, but they had inherited his teachings that they had gotten from the original apostles, whether that was the intimate three, the remaining nine, the 72, or the multitudes. And so Clement of Rome, Justin the Martyr, who died a suffering death, Irenaeus, Tertullian, these are only four of the second generation, or whom we would call the ante-Nicene fathers. But these fathers clearly attached themselves to a city, Clement of Rome, Irenaeus of Lyons, Tertullian of Alexandria, because they had a geographical assignment. But secondly, they purposely and with great intentionality called themselves bishops because they did not qualify. They were not contemporaries of Jesus and therefore could not qualify to be called an apostle. Well, friends, I thank you for your time and your patience. I'm just about through. Let me go here very, very quickly. By the year 325 CE, there would be over 600 bishops that would attend the first ecumenical council. Now, so you have bishops, these ante-Nicene bishops, who were scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. But by 300 years, the office of bishop would have expanded, would have exploded, until by the time the church came together to resolve some of their doctrinal issues, there would be 600 bishops in the church at the time who would come together and would participate in the first ecumenical council. Now, among other things, this first council would agree upon a simple statement or catechism that would be used throughout the church, known as the Apostles' or the Nicene Creed. Now, from that time until now, the office of the bishop would be seen as the highest office in the church. That takes up just about all of my time, and I certainly want to thank you for yours for the last several minutes, and I know it has indeed been several minutes. I've tried to walk you from the days of Jesus, what was going on during Jesus's day, the disciples that followed him, their becoming apostles, their dying, and the church continuing, leaving the next generation of leaders in the church available to call themselves bishops, not apostles, and who would continue to maintain the momentum of the church. Friends, I want to thank you so very, very much for sharing with me today. I've placed here on the screen my phone number, my email address, and even a link to a grouping, a bundle of courses that I have put together that expands greatly on that which I have been talking about. Now, this is the first in a series of lessons that I'll be doing with our bishops of the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, who are being trained to join the College of Bishops of the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. I do hope that you've enjoyed this information as much as I have enjoyed bringing it to you. Do take a look at our website at episcopalschool.teachable.com. Again, that is episcopalschool.teachable.com. There we have nearly 20 additional courses like what you have just experienced that help you flesh out, understand, and appreciate the office of the episcopacy, or the office of the bishop in the Lord's Church in general, and certainly within the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship in particular. Until next time, do remember, God loves you, I love you, and we look forward to seeing you real soon.